April 27, 1986. It is 12:49 a.m. on the east coast of the United States. Across the country, thousands of people are settling into their living rooms. The glow of cathode ray tube televisions illuminates the darkness. They are tuned in to home box office, widely known as HBO, to watch the 1985 spy thriller, The Falcon and the Snowman. The movie is playing normally, but in a split second, the screen flickers. The audio cuts out entirely. The movie is instantly replaced by the harsh, vibrating colors of a standard television test pattern. For a few seconds, viewers stare at the screen, assuming the network is experiencing a routine technical failure. A blown fuse in New York, perhaps. But then, text begins to slowly appear over the color bars, typed out in a crude, blocky computer font. It reads, "Good evening, HBO from Captain Midnight. $12.95 a month? No way. Showtime Movie Channel beware." This was not a glitch. It was a hostile takeover. A declaration of war against a multi-billion-dollar corporation, broadcast live into the homes of millions. In 1986, hacking was not something you did quietly from a laptop in a basement. The internet as we know it did not exist for the public. To pull off a hack of this magnitude, the attacker had to reach into the sky. They had to physically hijack a multi-ton communication satellite orbiting 22,000 miles above the Earth, overpowering the transmission of a massive media conglomerate using raw, analog force. This is the story of the ultimate high-tech rebellion, a feat of incredible engineering, and the frantic government manhunt that followed. To truly understand the gravity of this crime, we have to rewind and look at the forgotten landscape of 1980s television. In the early part of the decade, the sky was literally a wild west of unencrypted signals. If you lived in rural America, far away from the cities, standard cable television wiring simply did not reach your home. Your only option to get entertainment was to look up. People began installing massive motorized satellite dishes in their backyards. These were gigantic metal basins, often 10 to 12 feet wide. They were expensive, sometimes costing upwards of $3,000, but they came with a massive perk. Once you bought the hardware, the signals bouncing off the satellites in space were free. You could intercept raw feeds from news stations, sports channels, and premium movie networks. For a brief period, the sky belonged to everyone. But the massive television networks saw this as theft, and in January of 1986, HBO changed the landscape forever. They became the first major network to actively scramble their signal. They implemented a system called Video Cipher 2. Suddenly, the millions of people who had invested heavily in their backyard satellite dishes woke up to find their HBO channels reduced to unwatchable, distorted static. To get the picture back, HBO required viewers to purchase a bulky, expensive descrambler box and pay a monthly subscription fee of $12.95. The backlash was immediate and furious. Backyard dish owners felt betrayed. They argued that they had paid for the equipment to capture signals freely crossing their private property. Protests erupted. People literally burned HBO descrambler boxes in the streets. But while thousands of people complained, one man decided to actually do something about it. His name was John R. McDougal. He was 25 years old, a brilliant electronics engineer operating out of Ocala, Florida. John was not a cyber terrorist or a Russian spy. He was an incredibly hardworking guy trying to keep his small business afloat. He owned a shop that sold and installed those massive backyard satellite dishes. When HBO scrambled its signal, John's business collapsed almost overnight. Nobody wanted to buy a $3,000 dish just to pay another monthly fee. Financial ruin was staring him in the face. To make ends meet, John had to take a second job. He worked the night shift at the Central Florida Teleport, a major uplink facility that beamed signals up to various commercial satellites. And it was here, surrounded by millions of dollars of high-end broadcasting equipment, at the end of a grueling shift, that frustration pushed the young engineer over the edge. On the night of April 27th, John was alone in the control room. He was exhausted and angry about the slow death of his business. He looked at the massive 30-foot transmission dish sitting outside the facility. He knew exactly what it was capable of. HBO broadcasted its signal from a transmission center in Hauppauge, New York. They beamed their movies up to Transponder 23 on the Galaxy One satellite. From there, Galaxy One bounced the movie back down to North America. John knew he couldn't break into the New York facility, but he didn't need to. He just needed to be louder than them. Using the teleport's equipment, John swung the massive 30-foot dish and aimed it with pinpoint precision at the exact coordinates of the Galaxy One satellite in space. He tuned his transmitter to the exact frequency HBO was using. He fired up a character generator, a specialized machine used to put text on television screens, and typed out his manifesto. He chose the alias Captain Midnight after watching an old movie on TV just a few days prior. Then he reached for the power controls. This is where the hack becomes a high-stakes duel. In order to hijack a satellite, you have to execute an uplink jam. You send your own signal on the same frequency, but you crank the power up so incredibly high that the satellite is physically forced to drop the original signal and latch onto yours. It is a game of brute force. John boosted his transmission power, shooting a massive invisible beam of radio frequency energy directly into space. Inside HBO's control room in New York, the engineers were caught completely off guard. One second they were monitoring the movie, and the next, Captain Midnight was staring back at them. Panic set in. The technicians realized their feed was being actively crushed by an unknown source. Their immediate reaction was to fight back. The HBO engineers grabbed their own controls and boosted their transmission power, desperately trying to muscle their signal back onto the satellite. Down in Florida, John watched the control monitors. He saw HBO trying to fight back as the text began to flicker. So, he pushed his power even higher. For 4 incredibly tense minutes, an invisible war of radio waves was fought in the vacuum of space. The two transmission centers threw massive amounts of raw power at Galaxy One. But eventually, the engineers in New York realized the danger they were in. If both sides continued to escalate the power, the sheer amount of energy hitting the satellite could physically overload and permanently destroy the transponder in space. Terrified of causing millions of dollars in hardware damage to a satellite they didn't even own, HBO surrendered. They backed their power down. Captain Midnight had won. He held the screen for a few more moments, made his point, and then silently switched off his transmitter. The movie resumed. John packed up his things and went home, thinking he had just pulled off a harmless, victimless prank. He had no idea he had just triggered a national security crisis. When the sun came up the next day, the Federal Communications Commission, the FBI, and the United States Congress were in a state of absolute panic. You have to remember the era. It was 1986. The Cold War was still very real. Galaxy One did not just carry HBO movies. It shared space with sensitive corporate data and government communications. The realization that a single, unidentified citizen could commandeer a major satellite using brute force terrified Washington. If Captain Midnight could silence the biggest television network in America, what was stopping him from aiming his dish at a military satellite? What was stopping him from intercepting or jamming communications at the Pentagon? The manhunt that followed was aggressive and unprecedented. The penalty for satellite piracy was severe: federal prison time and fines up to $100,000. But finding the culprit was like looking for a needle in a haystack. In 1986, satellites did not have automated identification systems to track where signals were coming from. Investigators had to rely on pure detective work. They knew that an uplink jam of this magnitude required a massive commercial-grade transmission dish. You couldn't do this from a backyard. They painstakingly mapped out all 584 authorized uplink stations across the United States. They began cross-referencing logs, checking which stations had the specific character generator capable of producing the font used in the message. The net slowly began to tighten. But the fatal blow to Captain Midnight's anonymity came from a simple human error. A few days after the incident, a man made a call from a payphone in Florida. He had been talking to an engineer at the Central Florida teleport who had casually bragged about pulling off the hack. The man on the payphone called the FCC hotline and gave them the tip they needed. Federal agents descended on the teleport. They checked the employee logs for the night of April 27th. Only one person was on duty: John R. McDougal. Faced with overwhelming evidence, John surrendered. He was not treated as a terrorist, but as a man who made a very reckless point. He pleaded guilty to transmitting without a license in violation of federal law. He was fined $5,000, placed on a year of probation, and his license to operate satellite uplinks was suspended. John McDougal never wanted to destroy the system. He just wanted to prove that the little guy could still talk back to the giants, even if those giants lived 22,000 miles in the sky. Today, satellite communications are locked down with heavy, military-grade digital encryption. Executing an analog uplink jam of this nature is practically impossible. But for 4 minutes in the spring of 1986, a frustrated engineer from Florida took over the sky, proving that no technology is completely untouchable. The Captain Midnight incident remains a legendary anomaly in the archives of history. It is a lasting reminder of an era where the ultimate hack didn't require the internet, sophisticated malware, or lines of code. It just required a massive antenna, a huge amount of electrical power, and an unyielding desire to send a message.